A defenseless dog remained frozen in the middle of the moonlit countryside, encircled by the bright eyes of. His doom was certain as the coyotes closed in on him. But what transpired next left everyone stunned. An unexpected hero emerged from the shadows, and the countryside was eerily. Even still, the distant howls of coyotes were the only sound to break the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind that night. It was a typical evening in the valley, serene but characterized by the unbridled untamedness of nature. However, something out of the ordinary was going to happen tonight among the open fields tucked away. A small farmhouse lay at the border of a thick forest. Inside an old Mr. Sanders and Mrs. Sanders, a couple well known in the community for their fondness of animals that frequently take in stray animals and tend to their medical needs outside. Unaware of the drama that was about to happen, their farm animals slept in the barn. Bailey, a little, unkempt puppy, had just come onto their land. His golden fur was matted, and he appeared. The Sanders had discovered him quivering next to their porch a week prior. But he was undernourished, but his eyes shone with hope, and had been taking care of him ever since. Bailey was still shy and would frequently go just a few feet from the house before. That night, Bailey scampered back with his tiny tail between his knees. Been exploring the cool grass, chasing fireflies, and playing close to the barn while the moon was high, creating a. The air was clear and still, with a silvery shine over the landscape. But as Bailey approached the edge of the woodland, a low, guttural growl disturbed the silence, and Bailey froze. His ears perked up as other pairs of eyes appeared from the forest shadows. A group of coyotes was reflected in the moonlight like eerie green orbs. Their slender bodies moved stealthily, and their gazes were fixed on the small, helpless puppy Bailey was standing motionless. When the coyotes came out of the shadows, his little frame shook and their sleek, ravenous bodies moved within. Their low growls reverberated across the silent night, demonstrating their disturbing cooperation. Was accompanied by a big alpha, whose pointed teeth gleamed in the moonlight. The coyote's eyes were fixed on Bailey, filled with. The puppy took a tentative step back with predatory intent and gave a weak yelp, but his small legs were useless. Appeared to be paralyzed by fear and incapable of escaping the approaching threat. Mr. Sanders felt something wasn't right inside the farmhouse, so he looked out the window but couldn't see anything strange in the low light, but he dismissed it and went back to his drink. Bailey attempted to back away once more, his paws slipping on the damp, not realizing the danger that was just outside the barn. Grass, but the coyotes tightened their circle and increased the size of their growls. Louder, more aggressive postures, and the alpha's chilling bark, which told the pack to get ready for the kill. Then, as though anticipating the outcome, Bailey gave a frantic, high-pitched. The coyotes paused for a moment before howling a sound that was full of unadulterated terror and helplessness. The sudden shout stunned them for a minute, but their hesitation was brief. The coyotes started to lunge closer with their sharp jaws. "Bead," Bailey cried, and their hunger overcame any momentary prudence. The image seemed bleak and gloomy, with the man squatting low to the ground and trembling uncontrollably. But in the distance, there came a deep rumbling roar that completely changed the moment's balance and silenced the pack. The scream, which was far more frightening and potent than anything the coyotes could generate, reverberated around the valley like a. The coyotes stopped in their tracks as a rolling rainstorm struck, turning their heads and ears toward the woodland. Tingling as a big, shadowy figure started to emerge from the woods as the growl became louder and more apparent. Suddenly, its enormous frame was illuminated by the moon, displaying thick, shaggy fur and. It was a wolf. Not just any wolf, but the fabled lone wolf that was staring into Amber's eyes. Known to inhabit these areas, residents have long spoken of this enigmatic monster, referring to it as a protector of the. The coyotes in the woodland retreated a little, their growls being replaced by anxious snarls. Even the alpha paused, lowering its tail to evaluate the new danger, as the wolf advanced with a. With its purposeful grace and eyes focused on the group, it was obvious that this was no typical situation. The predator's presence evoked dread and reverence, and Bailey's huge eyes darted. Unaware of what was going on, The wolf lowered its head slightly and flattened its ears against the coyotes. It skulled and snarled once more, this time with greater depth and resonance. The scream made the coyotes shudder, and their bluster swiftly crumbled, with the alpha coyote reluctant to. It urged its flock to hold their ground by barking defiantly at its prey. But instead of faltering, the wolf charged forward with strength and speed. The coyote almost avoided the wolf's enormous paw swipe, yelping as it did so, surprising the leader. Realized they couldn't compete with the lone wolf and scurried backwards with the pack. As they started to back off, their growls changed to terrified yelps, and the wolf followed them a short distance to make sure they wouldn't return before coming to a sudden halt and facing Bailey again. The small puppy's big eyes were still frozen. The wolf, whose enormous body briefly towered above the little dog, approached him gently, filled with both terror and wonder. Uncertain of the wolf's intentions, Bailey shrank, but to his amazement, the wolf lowered itself to the ground, its movements steady and precise, and it growled softly, almost comfortingly, as though to. Bailey's ears perked up as he said, "You're safe now," and he cautiously took a step closer. Bailey's terror gradually subsided as the wolf stayed motionless, its amber eyes tender but vigilant. Started to wane and was replaced with a hesitant feeling of trust within the farmhouse. Mrs. Sanders went outside with a lantern and called out for Bailey after noticing the strange noise. She gasped as she swept across the yard and saw the amazing sight of the wolf and puppy together. As she comprehended the image, her palm went to her lips. "John," she cried, her voice shaking. "Come here quickly, mister." Sanders ran outdoors, reaching for the shotgun out of habit as his eyes widened at the sight of the wolf. He waited outside the door, but his wife interrupted him, saying in a stern but kind, "I don't believe it's here to harm us." The WF turned its head and met the human's eyes with amber ones for. For a brief instant, it appeared as though they were in quiet agreement. The wolf then got up and started to back away into the trees after giving Bailey one more glance. Bailey gave a quiet bark as if to express gratitude to the wolf, and the beast hesitated, taking one last look back. The Sanders stood still, staring toward the dark forest where the wolf was before vanishing into the shadows. Had vanished. Bailey was still shaking, but he safely padded back to them. With his tail wagging hesitantly, Mrs. Sanders took him in her arms and held him close to her heart. "Did you observe that John, who was running from the surreal meeting, whispered in awe that the wolf had saved him?" John nodded while letting his hand drop on the shotgun. "I've never seen anything like that wasn't a wild animal." Pretended that he was unable to articulate what he had seen the sea. Returned Bailey to the farmhouse, where he was checked for injuries. Fortunately, the dog was unhurt. Bailey, who was clearly disturbed, released a tiny whine and petted Miss Sanders' fur. John grumbled as he paced, nestling closer to his small body for comfort. Bailey was protected in the kitchen, which did more than simply frighten away the coyotes. Sanders scowled, and her hand paused in mid-stroke, as if it knew he missed him. "It has been observing him. Perhaps it has visited the farm previously, and we were unaware of it." The idea chilled us down her spine. Why hadn't the wolf appeared sooner if it had been close to their property, and why would a wild? The question of why a predator went out of its way to save a helpless puppy lingered in the back of their minds as Bailey refused to leave their side, cuddled up on the rug as they got ready for bed. The foot of their bed, but the wolf's penetrating amber eyes made it difficult for the Sanders to fall asleep. The following morning, John made the decision to conduct additional research armed with the coyotes' menacing snarls. He went into the woods with a camera and a strong sense of resolve, following the trail that the wolf had. Bailey tried to follow after him, understanding his owner's intent, but John gently took him and gave him to Mrs. Sanders. "Stay here," he ordered flatly. "The woodland was strangely quiet as John went farther, and I don't want any of you to get hurt because I know what's out there." He stopped as sunlight seeped through the canopy of the trees, creating dappled patterns on the ground, searching from time to time for evidence of the wolf's fur or any hint of its. Hours went by with no results. Irritated but refusing to give up, John continued until he came upon a tiny area with a group of boulders in the middle that appeared to. TFTs of fur were purposefully placed throughout, almost like a den, and pieces of bone evidence from previous meals. But what most interested him was, unexpectedly, a tiny, frayed collar was partially buried in the dirt when kneeling. John grabbed it up and gave it a close inspection. The collar was worn out and ancient. However, John mumbled that a faint inscription could still be seen on the tag shadow. He stood a moment ago, turning the collar over in his hands, wondering whose shadow was and how it related to the wolf. When a low growl came from the clearing's edge, Jan halted, his gaze leaping to the source that was coming out of the wolf. Shadows towered over the undergrowth in its enormous bulk, its amber. John's heart raced as his intense, unblinking gaze were fixed on him, but he forced to maintain his composure. He carefully raised his hands, keeping the collar firmly in place. Despite his racing heart, he spoke steadily and calmly, one of them easy. The wolf took a hesitant step forward, its eyes briefly darting between John and the collar, saying, "I'm not here to hurt you." To John's surprise, the wolf appeared to pause, as though considering whether to trust this human intruder, and then let. With its posture no longer menacing, it sat back on its haunches and let out a low whimper. John held out the collar. He questioned, feeling, "Is this yours?" as he watched the wolf sniff the air. To speak to a wild animal is ridiculous, but the wolf's response was anything but awed. As it lowered its head and poured another gentle whine onto the ground, John was struck with a sudden insight. Lightning, this wolf was a domesticated wolf, not just a wild animal. Shadow JN stated once more that Shadow was more than simply a name. It was its identity. The wolf's ears perked up a little at the name, confirming his guess that this creature had maybe been. How did someone's pet, buddy, and now guardian end up in the wild? Knowing why it had decided to keep Bailey safe, the wolf suddenly stood, its posture rigid. Jean heard a small rustling sound as it looked toward the woodland, indicating the arrival of something more. When Shadow growled in warning, Jan realized it was time to depart. John gripped the collar hard and backed away slowly, saying, "I'll go, but this isn't over." John then moved toward the farmhouse's mind was buzzing with inquiries about Shadow's actions and how they related to the collar, and its steadfast devotion to Bailey suggested a more profound tale, which he was resolved to unearth. When John presented his results to Mrs. Sanders at the farmhouse, she gaped at the collar in shock and traced her fingers. The name was inscribed, indicating that it formerly belonged to someone, and her voice was filled with. John nodded curiously, but this wolf Shadow is more than that. Bailey is being protected by happenstance, but there's a reason for it all. A tiny bark was released in response to the stress, and the sight of it tugged at John's collar, strengthening his resolve. There's more to this narrative, so we need to learn who Shadow is and why he's protecting Bailey. There was a mixture of curiosity and uneasiness in the Sanders kitchen, and John said, "I'm not stopping until I figure it out." Put the frayed collar on the table. Its existence is a quiet testament to the Shadow's mystery. Shadow misses. It's unbelievable that Xander, with her brow bent in contemplation, peered at it as if it would provide answers. Jan nodded, his hand laying on his chest while the wolf muttered, behaving as though it hadn't forgotten who it used to be. "It's not simply instinct," he remarked, pointing to Bailey's head as the puppy slept at his feet. Shadow identified the collar. "There's a backstory here, and I must know what it is, Mrs. Sanders." "Did you hesitate? We're talking about a wild animal, so don't assume it's safe." "What if it's harmful, John?" Leaning back in his chair with a contemplative expression, "I don't think it's if Shadow had many opportunities to harm Bailey or us, but instead it's been safeguarding him, but there's more going on here." Bailey's gentle voice cut off the conversation as Mrs. Sanders grinned dimly as she reached down and moved his tiny paws, which were flailing at the air. Regardless of Shadow's motivation, she stated that Bailey has faith in it, and that says a lot. For the following few days, John couldn't get rid of the thought that Shadow wasn't just there by accident. Determined to learn the facts, he started his inquiry by contacting nearby animal shelters, wildlife specialists, and even searched online discussion boards for hints on Shadow's origins. One evening, when I was perusing a Missing Pets Jan community website, I came across a post from. It was a picture of a dog that looked like a wolf and had amazing amber eyes from a few years ago. The message, which was from a family in a nearby town, had its name prominently displayed in strong characters beneath the picture Shadow. Seeking assistance in locating their cherished animal companion, Shadow, who vanished while camping in. The family searched the woods for him, but was never able to locate him, so this must. As he reviewed the information he hastily wrote down, John mumbled, his heart pounding. His hands trembled a little as he wrote down the contact details and dialed the number. A woman answered the phone. With a tone of cautious optimism, he said, "Hello, I'm John Sanders. Rushing out, I believe I may have located your dog Shadow." There was a lengthy. The woman on the other end of the line paused before continuing, her voice shaking with passion. "Shadow you found." J.N. described the events of the previous few days, including Shadow's whereabouts. The woman, who identified herself as Laura, listened carefully to her behavior and the collar he had discovered in the bushes. Excitement mounting with every detail, she eventually broke her voice. "That's our Shadow. I can't." Laura continued by sharing Shadow's story, saying that we didn't think we'd ever see him again, and that he had been more. He was more than simply her family's pet. He was a devoted friend and guardian who had previously rescued her little son from a hostile stray dog. Although Shadow had fled on a camping trip years prior after hearing distant coyotes roaring, John's thoughts raced as he put the pieces together, realizing that despite their best attempts, they had never been able to locate him. It all made sense now, since the wolf dog had probably come across the protective instincts of Shadow and his link with Bailey. Coyotes that night, and developed his survival skills in the wild, while maintaining his natural sense of duty and loyalty. "Need to visit him." J.N. stated that Shadow was still out there, and that I believed he had been keeping watch over us. Laura hesitated, "But I'll come now." "But what if he doesn't recognize me? It's been a long time." If Shadow recalls, Junk's voice was steady. "The following morning, Laura, I'm positive that anything about his history involves you." Upon arriving at the Sanders farmhouse, she nervously scanned the woods while holding a picture of a Shadow. She traced the image with her fingertips as if it may somehow call him. John gave her a warm greeting and introduced her to Mrs. "I believe that Sanders and Bailey Hune have been residing near the woods." Laura nodded, her face displaying a mixture of anxiety and hope. "I simply want to see him because he feels comfortable there. Once more, even if he doesn't recall me, I need to know that he's all right." John took her to the forest's edge, where they waited silently, Bailey detecting Laura's shoulders and the weight of the occasion sat silently at their feet as the minutes seemed to drag on for hours. Started to sigh in disappointment, but before she could say anything more, a well-known person appeared out of the shadows. When Shadow entered the clearing, his amber eyes briefly locked on Laura, and he paused, his stance stiff as Shadow. Laura whispered, her voice breaking, but she wasn't sure what to do. The wolf dog's ears twitched as she knelt down and held out her hand, and he took a hesitant step closer before taking another hand. Another Shadow ran at Laura, his tail waving wildly, as if a dam had finally cracked. Laura laughed. She put her arms around him and began to cry as she watched the reunion with John and Mrs. Sanders. Their hearts swelled in wonder as they watched Bailey bark excitedly and circle Shadow as if Shadow had returned home and was welcomed back into the group, but it was still unclear how he was related to Bailey. As Laura and Shadow embraced, John realized that their narrative was only getting started. It seemed like the closure of a long-lost period in Shadow's life. But for John, it was just the start of a more complex puzzle. Shadow's protective instincts were only a hint of the reason for his fierce loyalty to Bailey. Later that day, the Sanders family welcomed Laura inside to have dinner and talk about something more significant. Encounters with Shadow. Bailey, ever since the inquisitive puppy, appeared to be happy to have Laura nearby. Switching between, Laura exclaimed, "This is amazing," as she caressed her and Shadow as if sensing a connection between them all. "I never imagined seeing Shadow's fur again, much less seeing him defending a child like Bailey J.N. depended on. There's something about this that doesn't add up." Laura, he thought, his brow wrinkled. "Shadow didn't simply come across us. It seems as though he has been keeping watch over Bailey ever since we discovered him." Laura tilted her. "Taking into account what he said, are you implying that the Shadow was destined to discover John?" You paused and looked out the window toward the woods. "Perhaps. There's something about Bailey that made Drew Shadow talk to him, but the sound of distant howls caused everyone to freeze, directing their gaze to the forest. Shadow's ears pricked up, and John mumbled, "They're back," and stood up suddenly as the coyotes' Laura's face turned pale. Prior to John nodding, they had been an issue. They had been moving around the neighborhood for weeks, but they had never arrived this. Shadow, now completely awake, trotted to the door near the house and stood watch, adopting a protective and unwavering. Bailey scurried closer to him, apparently oblivious to the possible threat we must prevent them from. "Here," Jan said, reaching for a shotgun and flashlight. "Laura, you and Mrs. Sanders." Laura's expression was troubled as she glanced at Shadow. She wanted to leave, but she decided to stay inside with Bailey while I checked the perimeter. John hesitated, then replied, "All right, Shadow, let me go. With you. That's who he is." The howls became louder as the man and the wolf dog proceeded into the twilight, their breaths apparent in the cold air. Like a warning reverberating through the trees, Shadow deliberately moved, his keen senses leading John to the origin of. John's pulse raced at the sound when they arrived at a clearing and saw the scene in front of them. A group of coyotes had assembled, and as their eyes sparkled in the low light, they growled and hissed at one another. Shadow moved erratically and aggressively, stepping forward with his fur bristling and barking loudly at the coyotes. For a brief period, there was silence as they abruptly turned to face him. Predator-protector standoff. John held his shotgun firmly, prepared to step in if needed, but before he may happen if one of the coyotes bigger than the others did something unexpected. Moved ahead. It had scars from innumerable fights on its body and a missing portion of its ear. Shadow didn't snarl, or, instead of barking at this coyote, he tensed up, shifting from an aggressive to. As the two creatures gazed at one another, a quiet conversation took place between them. "What's this?" Jan whispering. The bigger coyote made a deep, guttural noise that sounded almost like a growl, but Shadow, who was gentler, answered with a string of quick, piercing barks while wagging his tail. John could see that these two had a past that was perhaps not submissive but acknowledged. Shadow knew Coyote from his experience in the wild, so he wasn't just any pack leader. The standoff ended suddenly. The scarred coyote turned and snarled at the other members of the pack at the start, telling them to back off one by one. With their cries fading into the night shadow, Coyote scuttled back into the shadows, remained there, and watched till the final coyote vanished. Then he turned with a sigh, and turned to face John again, his expression composed but aware of what had just transpired. "You knew him, didn't you?" Shadow didn't answer, of course, but his expression when you asked him to kneel and look at it. When they got back to the farmhouse, John felt uneasy since the eyes seemed to have a depth of comprehension. Told Laura and Mrs. Sanders about the encounter. Laura's face went white as she listened to whether Shadow knew the pack leader. She stated that implies he must have once been a member of a coyote pack. But why would he abandon them to defend them? Mrs. Bailey Sanders, who had been silent up until now, piped out. Perhaps he stayed. Perhaps he found something worth defending a family, which is why he picked Bailey. John nodded slowly, his mind racing as Shadow's past, much like the one he lost, was getting more obvious, but it left more questions than it did answers. What had motivated him to break away from the flock, and why did Tonight, as the family settles in for the evening, Coyotes listen to him. Shadow. Bailey snuggled up next to him, his small body pressing against the door, his amber gaze sweeping the dark forest. John regarded them with a feeling of unease hanging in his chest against the larger dog's side. Shadow's presence was Nevertheless, it was a conundrum that John knew he couldn't overlook tomorrow. Silently, they said, "We're going to discover the truth." The next morning, the first rays of sunlight broke through There is a sense of urgency as the Sanders farmhouse is illuminated by dense clouds. Flooded the air. Jan had little slept, his mind focused on the experience with the coyotes the night before and Shadow and their leader's peculiar kinship as they sat by the door watching as the family assembled for breakfast. As always, Bailey was as carefree as a puppy could be, and Shadow could feel his tiny tail waving wildly. Replied with a gentle prod, his protective nature apparently conflicting with an unsaid burden. John took a seat in his. "We need answers, and Shadow isn't just any dog." Coffee cup with a resolute thump. Laura nodded her head yesterday night, demonstrating that he's connected to something more significant. I have rescued and rehabilitated animals for years, but I have never witnessed behavior like Shadow's. He isn't only. There's more going on here than just instinctively shielding Bailey. I want to know what drew him to you, Mrs. Sanders. At any point, the practical voice said, if you're going to look for answers, where? John looked at Shadow, but he couldn't really tell you his life story. Do you even start? A glimmer of doubt crossed Shadow's face, perhaps not via words. Acknowledged, but deeds speak louder. He came here for a reason, why the Coyotes paid attention to him. If we do the same, he might show us Laura. Mrs. Sanders was doubtful, but I'll accompany you, Shadow. Trust me, 2 eyes are better than 1. Didn't protest, but keep in mind that those woods aren't usually welcoming to strangers. The plan was prepared, and supplies were packed. Jayan and Laura followed Shadow into the thick woodland in the clear morning air, while Bailey left securely in Mrs. Sanders' care. Spoke of moist earth and pine, but the woods themselves appeared eerily quiet. Shadow led the way. Do you suppose he's leading us? He's confidently standing with his nose to the ground, and his ears perking up and down at every sound. Laura whispered to the group, disturbing the silence. Perhaps Jan answered, or perhaps he's. They strolled in quiet for almost an hour, the forest getting deeper with every step, while he showed us something he left behind. At the edge of a rocky clearing, Shadow finally stopped. His body tensed, his ears pricked forward, and he let out a loud growl. Escaped his throat? Laura inquired, looking around the place, and John noticed. Coyotes, he whispered, his voice strained, a pair of bright eyes and a flash of fur in the distance. Reappeared, but instead of circling or growling this time, they maintained a wary distance while keeping their eyes focused. The scarred leader moved forward among them, his stance neither subservient nor hostile, as though. Shadow took a step closer while he waited, his tail wagging steadily but low. The scarred coyote's body language was nearly conversational as he put out a succession of muted barks and growls. Jayan and Laura reciprocated his calm and thoughtful gestures. Laura muttered, "They're communicating with perplexed stares, like if they're." After a few minutes of negotiation, the scarred coyote gave a piercing yelp, and the pack started to glide smoothly and unthreateningly back into the woods, and the leader paused for a bit more, locking eyes with Shadow before vanishing into the tree. Jan inquired in his voice, "What just happened?" Laura was so amazed that she knelt next to Shadow and stroked his fur, as if they realized that Shadow serves as a mediator as well as a defender, is adept in navigating both their and our worlds. But the encounter left John with additional inquiries. Why did the coyotes attack if Shadow was able to keep them at bay? What initially caused Laura's countenance to darken? Bailey? Perhaps they weren't hunting. Perhaps they were attempting to communicate something. The idea that both coyotes were opportunistic unnerved them. Predators. But the notion that they had a more profound purpose was nearly impossible to understand as they proceeded through They followed the forest shadow to a remote spot where the trees dwindled and a homemade den was ensconced. The den seemed deserted, with its entrance covered in weeds and covered in debris between two enormous boulders. Shadow, with his stance becoming more upset, smelled the ground closely and poured at the dirt around the old bones. Laura's eyes widened as she picked up the old collar she found buried in the leaves in the entrance. She mentioned another puppy and turned it over in her hands. It's ancient, but the name Dakota is still engraved on the tag. Dakota Jen reiterated, "Do you think Shadow knew him?" Laura said that she didn't know him, but Shadow sobbed softly, his eyes locked on the collar, and it was obvious that item might hold the secret to his past. We must acknowledge that the discovery may have evoked memories or a connection to a life he had left behind. Learn about Dakota's identity, Laura's resolute voice, and the reason Shadow gave us. The collar was heavy in Laura's pocket as they returned to the farmhouse, and the woodland appeared to observe them. Their secrets are only half disclosed for each new response they discover. "What's this Jan whispering?" The bigger coyote made a deep, guttural noise that sounded almost like a growl, but Shadow, who was gentler, answered with a string of quick, piercing barks while wagging his tail. John could see that these two had a past that was perhaps not submissive but acknowledged. Shadow knew Coyote from his experience in the wild, so he wasn't just any pack leader. The standoff ended suddenly. The scarred coyote turned and snarled at the other members of the pack at the start, telling them to back off one by one. With their cries fading into the night shadow, Coyote scuttled back into the shadows, remained there, and watched till the final coyote vanished. Then he turned with a sigh, and turned to face John again, his expression composed but aware of what had just transpired. "You knew him, didn't you?" Shadow didn't answer, of course, but his expression when you asked him to kneel and look at it. When they got back to the farmhouse, John felt uneasy, since the eyes seemed to have a depth of comprehension. Told Laura and Mrs. Sanders about the encounter. Laura's face went white as she listened to whether Shadow knew the pack leader. She stated that implies he must have once been a member of a coyote pack. But why would he abandon them to defend them? Mrs. Bailey Sanders, who had been silent up until now, piped out. Perhaps he stayed. Perhaps he found something worth defending a family, which is why he picked Bailey. John nodded slowly, his mind racing as Shadow's past, much like the one he lost, was getting more obvious, but it left more questions than it did answers. What had motivated him to break away from the flock, and why did Tonight, as the family settles in for the evening, Coyotes listen to him. Shadow. Bailey snuggled up next to him, his small body pressing against the door, his amber gaze sweeping the dark forest. John regarded them with a feeling of unease hanging in his chest against the larger dog's side. Shadow's presence was Nevertheless, it was a conundrum that John knew he couldn't overlook tomorrow. Silently, they said, "We're going to discover the truth." The next morning, the first rays of sunlight broke through There is a sense of urgency, as the Sanders farmhouse is illuminated by dense clouds. Flooded the air. JN had little slept, his mind focused on the experience with the Coyotes the night before and Shadow and their leader's peculiar kinship as they sat by the door watching as the family assembled for breakfast. As always, Bailey was as carefree as a puppy could be, and Shadow could feel his tiny tail waving wildly. Replied with a gentle prod, his protective nature apparently conflicting with an unsaid burden. John took a seat in his. "We need answers, and Shadow isn't just any dog." Coffee cup with a resolute thump. Laura nodded her head yesterday night, demonstrating that he's connected to something more significant. "I have rescued and rehabilitated animals for years, but I have never witnessed behavior like Shadow's. He isn't only. There's more going on here than just instinctively shielding Bailey. I want to know what drew him to you, Mrs. Sanders." At any point, the practical voice said, "If you're going to look for answers, where?" John looked at Shadow, but he couldn't really tell you his life story. "Do you even start?" A glimmer of doubt crossed Shadow's face, perhaps not via words. Acknowledged, but deeds speak louder. He came here for a reason, and why the Coyotes paid attention to him. If we do the same, he might show us Laura. Mrs. Sanders was doubtful. "But I'll accompany you, Shadow. Trust me, 2 eyes are better than 1. Didn't protest. But keep in mind that those woods aren't usually welcoming to strangers. The plan was prepared, and supplies were packed. Jan and Laura followed Shadow into the thick woodland in the clear morning air, while Bailey left securely in Mrs. Sanders' care. Spoke of moist earth and pine, but the woods themselves appeared eerily quiet. Shadow led the way. "Do you suppose he's leading us?" He's confidently standing with his nose to the ground, and his ears perking up and down at every sound. Laura whispered to the group, disturbing the silence. Perhaps Jan answered, or perhaps he's. They strolled in quiet for almost an hour, the forest getting deeper with every step, while he showed us something he left behind. At the edge of a rocky clearing, Shadow finally stopped. His body tensed, his ears pricked forward, and he let out a loud growl. Escaped his throat? Laura inquired, looking around the place, and John noticed. "Coyotes," he whispered, his voice strained, a pair of bright eyes and a flash of fur in the distance. Reappeared, but instead of circling or growling this time, they maintained a wary distance while keeping their eyes focused. The scarred leader moved forward among them, his stance neither subservient nor hostile, as though. Shadow took a step closer while he waited, his tail wagging steadily but low. The scarred coyote's body language was nearly conversational as he put out a succession of muted barks and growls. Jan and Laura reciprocated his calm and thoughtful gestures. Laura muttered. They're communicating with perplexed stares, like if they're. After a few minutes of negotiation, the scarred coyote gave a piercing yelp, and the pack started to glide smoothly and unthreateningly back into the woods, and the leader paused for a bit more, locking eyes with Shadow before vanishing into the tree. Jan inquired in his voice, "What just happened?" Laura was so amazed that she knelt next to Shadow and stroked his fur, as if they realized that Shadow serves as a mediator as well as a defender, is adept in navigating both their and our worlds. But the encounter left John with additional inquiries. Why did the coyotes attack if Shadow was able to keep them at bay? What initially caused Laura's countenance to darken? Bailey? Perhaps they weren't hunting. Perhaps they were attempting to communicate something. The idea that both coyotes were opportunistic unnerved them. Predators. But the notion that they had a more profound purpose was nearly impossible to understand as they proceeded through They followed the forest shadow to a remote spot where the trees dwindled and a homemade den was ensconced. The den seemed deserted, with its entrance covered in weeds and covered in debris between two enormous boulders. Shadow, with his stance becoming more upset, smelled the ground closely and poured at the dirt around the old bones. Laura's eyes widened as she picked up the old collar she found buried in the leaves in the entrance. She mentioned another puppy and turned it over in her hands. It's ancient, but the name Dakota is still engraved on the tag. Dakota. Jen reiterated, "Do you think Shadow knew him?" Laura said that she didn't know him, but Shadow sobbed softly, his eyes locked on the collar, and it was obvious that item might hold the secret to his past. We must acknowledge that the discovery may have evoked memories or a connection to a life he had left behind. Learn about Dakota's identity, Laura's resolute voice, and the reason Shadow gave us. The collar was heavy in Laura's pocket as they returned to the farmhouse, and the woodland appeared to observe them. Their secrets are only half disclosed for each new response they discover. Laura's voice was barely audible above the rustling leaves as she questioned, and John shook his head. "I'm not sure, but they've has a plan, and he can tell by looking at Shadow that this isn't a coincidence." The farther they went, the more the forest appeared to came to life. Distant howls reverberated through the trees, mingling with the rustle of invisible things and the cries of nighttime birds. Suddenly, every sound seemed to be amplified as the temperature dropped, and the earthy smell of moss and moist dirt was carried with it. The scarred coyote abruptly stopped its ears from perking as each shadow grew sharper. Shadow mimicked its movements as it sniffed the air, his amber eyes sweeping the area and letting out a low, guttural growl. The coyote's packmates hunched down, their fur rumbling from its throat. Laura muttered, "What's going on?" and Shadow hissed in response, his body stiff and his heart quickening. Alert John held up his flashlight, its glow piercing the night, and what he The sight of dozens of blazing eyes staring back at him from a larger group of coyotes in the shadows sent a shiver down his spine. There was a noticeable sense of tension in the air, with their bodies barely visible in the surrounding underbrush. Laura questioned, "Are they threatening us?" with a hint of panic in her voice. "I don't think so," John said. Even if he tightened his hold on the flashlight, GOI would have attacked by now if they had intended to. With its head raised, the scarred coyote walked forward and gave the area a succession of harsh, purposeful barks. Coyotes reciprocated, their screams reverberating like a chorus throughout the woodland. Laura was chilled by the almost melancholy element in Shadow's howl, which he added to the mix. She added that her dread was giving way to awe as if they were conversing. "But what are they?" Stating that the scarred coyote approached Shadow, lowering its body language as it changed from tense to almost reverent. The other coyotes followed suit, cocking their heads slightly, as if to acknowledge Shadow's authority. Less aggressive postures, John let out a deep breath, his shoulders letting go. He recognized that Shadow is directing them as well as us, and they are accepting him. The scarred coyote turned and started to move again, as though to validate what John had said. Shad moved into the leader's stride this time, with the larger group trailing closely behind. Laura looked at John with assurance and purpose, her face displaying a mixture of dread and resolve. "We must continue," she added, adding that whatever this is, it's more than. We assumed that the human duo would continue their trek, now with the silent on either side. The group of vigilant coyotes moved in uncanny synchrony, their pace hardly moving, creating a noise on the forest floor. The trees appeared to get taller, and the forest appeared to change the further they traveled. And with age, their gnarled branches created a thick canopy that obscured the stars. As the temperature dropped, and they could hear the sound of running water, the group eventually emerged into a clearing, and the enormous old tree that loomed before them astounded them. Stood in the middle, its roots bending and spreading out across the ground like the earth's veins. The bark of the tree was worn and scarred, yet in its core was a power and knowledge that was almost tangible. This is it, a sizable, shallow depression that is full of crystal-clear water that reflects the moonlight like a mirror. This is what Shadow intended us to find, Laura said in a tremulous tone, as the scarred coyote moved toward the other coyotes followed their movements as the water lowered its head to drink. At the edge of the clearing, Shadow stood calmly and deliberately, staring at the tree as if it possessed the answers. John and Laura moved closer to each query, their gazes flitting between Shadow. John spoke out loud. "What is this place, the ancient tree? It feels sacred." Laura's response was no more than a whisper, as if it had always been there. Shadow turned to face them, his eyes locking. Laura experienced an intense sense of purpose at that precise time, as if Shadow informed her that although they had arrived at the core of the mystery, there was still something lacking. As the party stood in the clearing, the tranquil atmosphere was suddenly broken by something they had not yet discovered. A spooky, guttural howl that was deeper and more menacing than any coyote could have come from the woodland behind them. Shadow stiffened, his ears perked, and his fur bristled when they heard the call. Coyotes also responded uneasily, becoming restless in their motions. What was Laura whispering while clutching John's arm tightly? John looked around the trees, his flashlight beam piercing the darkness. Something was amiss. "That's not friendly," he remarked grimly, and the scarred coyote moved forward, barking sharply that. The other coyotes gathered around it, creating a loose protective circle shadow, while it reverberated around the clearing. Himself close to John and Laura, his posture alert and protective, then abrupt movement. Rustled in the brush along the clearing's edge, and many pairs of eyes glinted in the shadows, getting bigger and more. The growling became more intense, more sinister than the Coyotes. And then a bundle of wool appeared, its enormous shapes glowing in the wolf's fur was unlike anything Laura or JN had ever seen in the faint moonlight, was matted and dark, and their eyes shone with a brightness that seemed almost supernatural. The leader was a tall black wolf with John, a wolf with jagged scars across its muzzle, stepped forward with its jaws in a frightening snarl, said in a stern voice, indicating that it is a pack alpha and appears to be here to challenge the wolves and coyotes. The scarred coyote barked defiantly as they moved forward cautiously, their motions deliberate and predatory. Shadow joined it to face the alpha, standing erect and maintaining a fixed stare. Laura's heart thumped in her chest as she focused on the impending danger. "What should we do?" John firmly pulled her behind him as she requested in a shaky voice. "We stay back." As the two groups engaged in combat, the tension in the area was evident as the wolves growled and showed their superiority by snapping their jaws, but the coyotes refused to back down. When the scarred coyote roared in unison, the pack echoed back, their voices rising into the darkness. Joined the chorus with a powerful, commanding howl, and the leader wolf charged forward, its enormous jaws snapping. The coyote swerved nimbly, its motions swift and accurate, shadow passing only inches from the scarred coyote's face. The clearing burst into mayhem as he snarled fiercely and caused the wolf to temporarily retreat. Growls filled the air as wolves and coyotes clashed, their teeth flashing and their paws striking. Even though they were tiny, the coyotes battled with a fierceness that came from desperation and solidarity. Shadow was a flurry of movement, demonstrating unrivaled power and agility while protecting his human friends and the coyotes. Laura and Jan were unable to cry as they stared in stunned silence as their instincts cried out for them to run. Aside from being horrifying, the conflict inspired a frank demonstration of nature's cruelty, and tenacity. The black wolf appeared to recognize Shadow's importance and went straight at him with a strong leap. It swung at Shadow, its enormous jaws aimed for his throat. Shadow confronted the assault directly. With a force that rocked the earth, bodies collided, rolling together while snapping and roaring as they each tried to get the upper hand. Shadow. Laura sobbed as she moved forward out of instinct. "John, stay back." Seizing her arm, he said urgently, "He can handle this." Shadow's power and will were evident, but for a brief while, it appeared that the alpha wolf would overwhelm him due to his size and experience. But then, a remarkable event occurred when the scarred coyote saw the Shadow in peril. It howled sharply and launched. The wolf was forced back together by the other coyotes' collective force as they followed the alpha, forming a Shadow is protected by the alpha wolf, whose bravery and devotion shine through against the overwhelming odds. Paused, its supremacy was questioned for the first time, and it gave a low, golden roar, eyes narrowing as it evaluated the situation, then turning and retreating into the forest with a final snarl. The woodland became quiet as the coyotes stood, and the other wolves followed suit, their defeat visible in their hunched positions. Shadow hobbled, triumphant, their bodies damaged but their spirits unbroken. His eyes were gleaming with joy, but his fur was matted with mud as he walked closer to Laura and John. "You did it, Laura." John knelt down and murmured, "You saved us." She wrapped her arms around him, his hand lying softly on Shadow's head next to them. "You're an amazing friend," murmured quietly, "but why endure all of this?" The scarred coyote came closer. For a brief time, as its golden eyes met John's, it appeared to transmit a mutual understanding that was beyond words. Purpose that went beyond the altercation. Laura turned to face the old tree, which was motionless and alert. "Something here," she said, "something there," shielding Shadow, who turned to face the tree where he lay. The scarred coyote joined him, its eyes focused on the human chairs. "Whatever it is, John," and spoke to them to follow. Muttered, getting up and about to discover that Shadow and the scarred. Laura and Jan looked at one another as the coyote deliberately approached the old tree, their interest surpassing their. Fear and fatigue followed as they cautiously crossed the disturbed ground and splintered limbs that were left behind from the tree towered over the earlier pandemonium, its twisted branches twisting against its enormous trunk, carved by weather and time like skeletal arms in the starry sky, had a majestic quality about its existence, something that required respect. Shadow paused at the base of his ears. Laura muttered, "What's so special about this tree?" He was attentive and stiff, as if he was waiting for people to catch up. John shook his head. "I'm not sure why," but her breath was apparent in the chilly night air. "It's obvious that Shadow and the coyotes believe it's crucial that the scarred coyote cry in mourning and the other." Shadow joined them, and coyotes gathered around their golden eyes, reflecting an unspoken agreement, assuming a solid yet reverent stance, as though honoring some invisible force. John stepped closer, using his spotlight to inspect the tree's base. "There's something here," he whispered, his voice laced with. Laura squatted next to him, her eyes following the light beam with a look of pleasure. A hole that was partially hidden by moss and fallen leaves was embedded in the roots. It was deep enough to hide. She whispered, scarcely raising her voice above a whisper. "What's in there? Something or someone?" When John carefully brushed the material out of his hand, he discovered a little bundle wrapped in what looked to be worn cloth. The coyotes closely monitored every move, as Laura cautioned that it might. John acknowledged the danger, but he persisted in pulling the bundle loose as his fingers trembled a little. Unfolded, revealing a variety of items, including an ancient leather-bound journal. Laura gasped as she saw a small locket and a carved wooden sculpture of a dog that looked eerily like Shadow. John opened the journal, his hands trembling with cold and excitement, and found that the pages were fragile. He perused the first few entries, his brow furrowing as he attempted to make sense of the words, which were written in faded handwriting. He remarked, "It's a journal," in a tone of astonishment, "that belonged to someone who lived here decades ago, wrote about the animals in this forest and the coyotes that Laura showed up over his." "Look at this," she remarked, pointing to her shoulder as her eyes scanned the delicate calligraphy. An entry from more than 50 years ago stated that these woods are a haven for coyotes are creatures that seek refuge. They are more than just animals. The world has long forgotten John's heart, but the guardians safeguard something much bigger than themselves. Raced as he turned the pages. The entry described a close bond between the creatures of the forest and the land itself, suggesting a long-standing connection that people formerly respected but eventually abandoned, according to the journal's author. After suffering an injury that left her trapped in the wilderness, naturalist Eleanor Reed explained how the coyotes had saved her life. She had devoted her life to protecting their sanctuary out of appreciation for the forest. John spoke to the guardians while observing the coyotes that were keeping a close eye on them, because they had been guarding this location for generations. Laura took the locket and opened it to discover a tiny picture of Elena, a woman they assumed was holding a dog that looked a lot like Shadow. Unquestionably, they were connected, and the knowledge weighed hard on them. It seemed as though Shadow was meant to lead us here, Laura murmured in an awe-filled voice, and before they could comprehend it further, the pack had returned their attention to the edge of the forest, their bodies tight and alert, when the coyote caught their attention. They sensed something John said, and he rose to his feet from the growl low, his hair bristling. A tall, wiry man who appeared in the shadows was human, yet unfamiliar. Wearing tough outdoor clothing that indicated he was familiar with the wilderness, he had a gun slung over his shoulder. The man drew a shoulder, his gaze hard and calculating. Laura's condescending tone made it seem as though I had discovered something intriguing. She moved automatically. John's growl deepened as he moved closer to Shadow, who was standing guard in front of her, obstructing the man's path. "Who are you? And why are you here?" Jen questioned. "Choose. Carter has been following this group for weeks." And the man chuckled as his eyes darted between the coyotes' names and the people. Didn't anticipate finding company, but Laura followed them and inquired in a suspicious tone why Carter was grinning. "People are willing to pay for things like extended coyotes' territory and their pelts, and this pack has been." John's clenched fists have been a constant thorn in my side. "You can't just hunt them down." Carter laughed and said, "This forest is protected by a bunch of trees. This country is ready for the taking, so huggers and their fairy stories are welcome." As the coyotes roared, the tension increased. Their instincts in harmony, obviously sensing Carter as a danger. Shadow moved forward, his gaze fixed on the fearless. "You must leave, John," he replied firmly, his voice steady. Carter's face hardened despite the mounting panic in his chest, saying, "Not a chance, I've got business here." For his rifle, and Laura gulped, holding on to John's elbow as the coyotes surrounded Carter, their actions methodical and, with a concerted snarl, Shadow's body coiled like a spring, ready to strike, and John repeated what he had said. The impasse has now reached its breaking point, and he is rising urgently. Gun. But Shadow sprang forward with a strong leap before he could aim. Of motion, mayhem broke out in the clearing once more, but this time the conflict wasn't between animals, but rather between humans and the natural world. As Shadow pounced at Carter's, the coyotes shifted in unison as he bared his teeth and let forth a powerful howl from his chest. Carter lurched backward, his grip on the weapon wavering as he attempted to encircle the intruder. Their instincts working in unison, tried to repel the snarling creatures, but Laura yelled in terror. She observed the altercation, but her words appeared to fade into the din of growls and, in response to Carter's desperate cries, John took Laura by the arm and held her behind him. Carter swung the weapon as he gave the order, his gaze flitting between the coyotes and Carter, who knew what they were doing. The weapons but randomly caught one of the coyotes on its flank. The animal yelled and scurried away, but the Shadow remained at the forefront, his motions crisp and sharp as others surged closer, their teeth snapping at his boots. Carter spit out, his voice shaking with rage, "You think you can scare me?" as if he were leading the pack. Time seemed to halt as he raised the weapon once more and pointed it directly at Shadow, facing worse than a pack of mutts. Before Carter could shoot the scarred coyote, Laura shouted, her voice breaking with anguish. With unexpected force, it slammed into Carter's side, knocking the rifle out of his hands and sending it spinning. Shadow took advantage of the chance to jump upon Carter's chest and pin him to the ground across the dirt. Sharp gasps of frightened breathing were heard as Shadow loomed inches above him. The pack closed in their growls, creating a low, threatening sound from Carter's face. "Chorus, I call them off," Carter yelled, his bluster giving way to unbridled terror. "Them away from me." John gently moved forward, his voice quiet yet firm. Shadow enough, his words carried a tension that hung heavy in the air, and Shadow's ears perked at the sound of a blend of authority and trust. As though seeking confirmation, Shadow's golden eyes met John's. He stepped back with a low growl, his stance defensive but no longer hostile, and the pack followed him. The automobile stumbled backward, giving Carter ample space to climb to his feet, his eyes darting. "You people are crazy," he mumbled, between the humans and the coyotes. Wiping dirt from his cheeks, he pointed firmly and stated, "This isn't over. Yes, it is." To the rifle that is a few feet away, "Get your weapon and go. Don't return." Carter paused, his face contorted with humiliation and annoyance. With no other option, he retrieved the coyotes that were still ready to attack. The weapon, moving slowly and deliberately before retreating into the darkness as the jungle engulfed him. The pack let their growls fade into quiet as Shadow approached Laura. She knelt down, put her arms around him, and buried her face in his, her tail bobbing slightly as though she was looking for assurance. "You were amazing, his fur," she muttered, her voice trembling with emotion. John joined them and, knowing what he was doing, put a palm on Shadow's head. They all did, and the scarred coyote came up to meet John's gaze with a serene, almost knowing look. The other coyotes gathered around their formation, now more at ease, if he were accepting their shared victory. Laura looked back at the elders, their golden eyes softly gleaming in the moonlight as the adrenaline started to wear off. "Elena abruptly wrote about them becoming guardians in that tree notebook," she said. John gently nodded, his eyes moving to the hollow, asking if he thought they were protected tonight. He told them that they had been preserving this forest for generations, and that they had discovered the relics there. "Tonight they, surrounding us as well." The pack started to spread out their motions with grace and purpose as they blended into the scarred coyote and Shadow alone watched as John and Laura collected the journal locket and John stated that we must ensure Elena's safety, so let's take these wooden figurines back. Laura grinned with tears in her eyes as she said, "Their story is preserved, and perhaps it's time for people to see them for what they truly are, protectors rather than predators," as they claimed. Shadow accompanied them on their journey back to the cottage, his head held high and his tail gently waving the scarred. With his silhouette outlined by the moonlight, the coyote paused at the edge of the clearing and emitted a solitary, melancholy cry. For John and Laura, the howl that reverberated across the woodland was a promise and a warning about what would happen. The night was more than simply a near-death experience. They were a revelation. They had seen something remarkable. Relationship between people and the natural world that went beyond mistrust and anxiety as they stepped. They knew their life and their perspective of the wilderness would never be the same after entering the cozy cabin. Although the cabin offered a sharp contrast to the terrifying events of the night, Laura and Jan remained tense, and Shadow snuggled up. His body was obviously exhausted by the fireplace, but his spirit remained unwavering beyond the wilderness. Laura set the notebook locket in the eerie silence that had descended, as though the land itself was collecting its breath. Eleanor whispered to herself, "The wooden figurine on the table feels heavier than before Eleanor's story." John bowed his head as we traced the journal's aged leather and discovered something much larger than we had ever thought. Staring at the things, it's no longer simply Elior's story, it's Shadow's now. The wolves' thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock, and Jan and Laura had a. Jan took the shotgun he kept by the door with a cautious look because nobody should be out here, especially at this hour. His voice was steady as he shouted out, his hands tight, but his mind racing. Dr. Foster responded. The local wildlife biologist's familiar voice was unexpected but comforting. With caution, John opened the door to find Dr. Foster standing on the porch, her face illuminated by a lantern. "Received your message earlier," she remarked, entering, and her eyes grew wide as she saw Shadow sleeping by the the stress engraved into John and Laura's relationship and the items on the table. Jan responded, "What happened? It's a long story," and shut the door after her, although, in a nutshell, Dr. Foster's face changed when the pack protected us tonight. Laura nodded, going from incredulous curiosity to incredulity, but the Coyotes had protected you. Her voice was forceful. They collaborated as though they were doing more than just protecting us. Understood exactly what was at stake. It wasn't random Dr. Foster, they knew Dr. Foster knelt beside Shadow, her trained eyes scanning the animal's injuries. "Coyotes are amazing," she whispered, lightly stroking his fur. "Clever. But this is remarkable since it detailed the events of a night that Dr. Foster's. I've spent years studying packs like this, but I've never witnessed behavior like what you're describing, so my interest rose. This kind of cooperation and loyalty is unprecedented." Jan leaned. "There's more to this forest than just the wildlife," he remarked, leaning his arms across the table. "Dr. Foster's journal suggests that these creatures have been guarding something here for generations." Laura hesitated as her gaze flitted to the journal. "May I?" she inquired, pointing to it. "Take a moment before nodding." "That's why we're here," Foster turned the pages, her expression a mix of wonder and focus. The pack's drawings, the thorough notes. Elena's reflections on their actions depicted a connection between the Coyotes and the soil that, beyond instinct. She wasn't only watching them, Dr. Foster stated in her voice. She was mentioned in their story in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper. Shadow's piercing bark brought their attention to the. At the edge of the clearing, the scarred coyote stood, his silhouette stark against the starry forest. He allowed, released a low, melancholy howl, and Shadow's body tensed up in anticipation of Hune's summoning. Laura remarked, "They need him back," with a heavy sigh in his voice. Dr. Foster stood her G with the knowledge that he belonged with them after the scarred coyote. If an outsider calls, a pack is unlikely to accept them, especially if they have been gone this long. Laura knelt next to Shadow, her hands shaking, indicating that he had earned his spot. "You've done so much for us," she added quietly as she caressed his fur, "but it's when it was finally time for you to return home." Shadow licked her palm, and his eyes were filled with a mixture of determination and thankfulness. Stood, moving steadily but deliberately, and approached the door, stopping too. As John opened the door, Laura wiped away a tear and said, "Be safe," whispering to Shadow, "Look back at them one last time." Trotted into the clearing, his figure merging with the coyotes' damaged bodies as they vanished into the woodland, their forms obscured by the shadows, and Dr. Foster touched. "What you've experienced tonight is uncommon," Laura whispered softly, "because these animals have trusted you with their narrative. That's a gift." Laura nodded, her voice trembling, but she was adamant that we couldn't allow. As the night became darker, the three of them sat by the fire, and their story came to a conclusion. Conversation turning to the future, Jan and Laura shared their plans to preserve the forest to protect the legacy of. Dr. Foster promised to help Eleanor and the pack, saying he would utilize her links to raise awareness of the region's ecological significance outside the. Somewhere in the distant, the woodland no longer felt empty, even if it was still quiet. With their links stronger than ever, the pack was moving together in the warmth of. The weight of the night's events began to fall on John, Laura, and Dr. Foster at the cabin, into a deep understanding that they were now a part of a narrative of connection that was far bigger than themselves. The following morning, the forest appeared to awaken with resiliency and the unbreakable bonds between humanity and the wild. The sunshine filtering through the trees brought a fresh sense of tranquility. Laura and John stepped outside, their breaths apparent in the golden beams that spanned the area where the cabin stood. Laura observed, her voice laced with the fresh morning air and their thoughts lingering on Shadow's departure. "It feels quieter." John nodded, but they were still out there, watching, both with sadness and with hope. It was remarkable last night when Dr. Foster joined them on the porch with a hot cup of coffee, claimed that it's uncommon to have such a strong bond between people and wildlife. "You've become a part of there." Laura looked to the edge of the woodland where the scarred coyote had been the previous evening, and they had become a part of the story. Of ours, a strategy started to take shape as the three of them talked about what to do next. The notebook, the artifacts, and the The preceding several days' events were a call to action for Elena's work shadows, not just personal experiences. It was necessary to share the pack's bond and bravery with the world. We'll begin by recording everything that Dr. Foster advised, including your observations and interactions with. John emphasized that this narrative must reach those who can assist in preserving this land, and we will collaborate with local conservation organizations to guarantee the preservation of the forest and its fauna. This area is not only ours, it is theirs. In the weeks that followed, Laura and John fully committed to their new mission, working with Dr. Foster to create a thorough report on the forest's distinct ecology and the coyote pack's amazing behavior. The core of their story consisted of photographs of shadow drawings from Elena's notebook and thorough descriptions of the pack's activities. Eventually, news of their work spread, attracting the attention of journalists, conservationists, and even an article titled "Guardians of the Forest: A Tale of Coyotes' Courage" was published by a local news outlet. Relationship that garnered a lot of support for their cause, while Laura and John found comfort in their deepening ties to the nature. Every woodland trip yielded fresh insights and indications of the gentle rhythms of nature, the delicate beauty of wildflowers, and pack's presence were all profoundly felt when Shadow was gone. However, as Laura strolled down the well-known path to the clearing one afternoon, his legacy persisted in each step they made. She saw something strange. A tiny bundle of leaves and twigs was neatly organized next to the base of an old tree. There was a feather among them, its edges faded, but its colors vivid. Tears filled her eyes as she bent to take up the present after realizing it was a sign of recognition from the pack. She mumbled, "Thank you, feather," and was carried away by the soft breeze. Back at the cabin, she arranged the feather next to Elena's belongings to create a tiny shrine in remembrance of their relationship. Formed with the forest and the people that live there, it became a representation of hope, resiliency, and the eternal spirit of Link. The months became seasons, and the forest flourished because to the community's careful maintenance and the efforts of Dr. Foster and Laura John helped create a protected reserve, ensuring that the land would continue to serve as a refuge for future generations by bringing youngsters to school, brought families to the region, encouraging a greater respect for nature. But the most significant events were Laura and John used to sit on the porch of the cabin and look at the quiet ones, woodland, and sometimes as the sun went down, they could hear the pack howling in the distance. As the sky became a deep shade of indigo one evening, Laura was reminded of the wild hearts that had touched their life. Asked, "Do you think Shadow remembers us?" as she leaned against John and moaned. John grinned subtly, while keeping his eyes on the horizon. "I believe he knows we'll never forget him." Their story's cornerstone was the call to action, which was sparked by their experiences. Laura and John started using social media, workshops, and presentations to share their journey, and their message was unmistakable. The natural world should be embraced, cherished, and protected rather than being viewed from a distance. The result of their labors was the release of a book called The Pea's Legacy: A Journey of Courage and Relationship. The book, which was co-written with Dr. Foster, detailed their adventures, Elena's findings, and the principles they had learned from the forest, and it went on to become a bestseller that touched people's hearts worldwide and sparked a surge of. As Laura and John considered their journey, they came to the realization that the best gift, what they had gained, was not prosperity or recognition, but rather a strong, unbreakable tie with the Shadow. The pack and Elena's spirit had shown them the forest and its people, the strength of resilience, the beauty of compassion, and the power of connection. Many years later, they were sitting by the cabin's fireplace, which is now a center for ecological. Laura carefully handled the feather's edges after taking it from the shrine for her examination. John replied, "Do you think Elena would be proud?" and put a palm over it, softened over time but still with brilliant hues. "I believe she would, and her eyes would be filled with appreciation, happy that we continued her story outside the jungle, which was teeming with life. Rhythms as old as the earth itself," and a recognizable scream resounded across the trees in the distance, serving as a reminder that, if this story resonated with you, the connection they had made with the outdoors was as timeless as the forest's timeless beauty. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of bravery, devotion, and the unbreakable relationship between animals. Join us in honoring the animal kingdom's heroes and keep checking back for our. You won't want to miss the next story.